The wind howled through the trees as snow blanketed the ground in an endless white sheet. In the heart of the storm, a tiny golden Labrador puppy trudged through the cold, his paws sinking into the freezing snow. He was alone, but he wasn't giving up. Suddenly, he stumbled upon something, a lifeless kitten, barely breathing, buried in the snow. What would you do if you found something so fragile in the middle of a storm? Would you walk away or risk everything to save it? The snowstorm descended upon the small Vermont town with an unrelenting ferocity, turning streets, trees and rooftops into indistinguishable mounds of white. The icy wind howled, whipping through the empty streets and carrying with it a bitter chill that penetrated to the bone. In the midst of this wintry chaos, Max, a golden Labrador puppy no more than 8 weeks old, staggered through the deep snow. His once sleek golden coat was now dirty and matted, caked with frost and mud. His ribs pressed sharply against his thin frame, each breath he took visible in the freezing air. Max had been on his own for weeks, wandering aimlessly through the town's outskirts. Born to a stray mother under the shell of an abandoned car, Max was her only surviving pup. For 5 weeks, she had kept him warm, sharing every scrap of food she could scavenge. But illness had claimed her life suddenly, leaving Max to fend for himself far too young. Hunger had become his constant companion, gnawing at him relentlessly. But it was the loss of her warmth, her protection, that had truly left him broken. The storm had worsened rapidly, leaving Max no choice but to search desperately for shelter. Each step was a struggle, his paws sinking deep into the snow, his small body trembling with cold. The wind bit at his nose and ears, and the snow clung to his fur, weighing him down even further. He stumbled, collapsing briefly into the icy powder, but forced himself to stand again. Something deep inside him urged him forward, a small but burning will to survive. As Max trudged onward, his dull brown eyes caught a faint shape in the distance. At first, he thought it was another mound of snow, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a kitten. The tiny creature lay motionless, her body partially buried under the snow. Her white fur was soaked through, clinging to her frail frame, and her folded grey ears drooped lifelessly. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and one of her eyes was swollen shut, glistening with illness. Max hesitated. Instinct told him to move on, to save what little strength he had for himself. Survival on the streets had taught him that much. But as he stared at the kitten's fragile form, something stirred inside him. She reminded him of himself, small, helpless, and clinging to life with what little strength she had left. Max lowered his head, nudging her gently with his nose. She didn't respond, her tiny body limp in the snow. A pang of panic shot through him, but it was quickly replaced by a resolve he didn't fully understand. Carefully, Max gripped the kitten's scruff in his small jaws, lifting her as gently as he could. She was so light, her frailty startling him. Her head hung awkwardly, her fur dripping with melting snow. Max looked around, his vision blurred by the storm. He didn't know where to go, but then he saw it, a faint, golden glow flickering through the blizzard. It was a house, its warm light barely visible in the storm. It became his beacon, his only hope. The journey was torturous. Each step was an effort, the snow deep and unyielding under his paws. The wind howled around him, stinging his eyes and whipping against his face. His legs trembled, the weight of the kitten, though light, becoming heavier with every passing moment. Yet Max pushed forward, driven by an instinct stronger than his exhaustion. The kitten's faint breaths against his chest were his motivation, a reminder that her survival now depended entirely on him. The light grew closer, but every inch felt like a mile. Max's body ached, his paws numb from the cold. He stumbled again, collapsing into the snow. For a moment, he lay there, panting heavily, his breath forming small clouds in the air. But he couldn't stop. The kitten needed him. With a groan, he stood, his legs shaking as he lifted her once more, and continued his slow, painful march toward the light. Finally, Max reached the house. Its golden glow illuminated the snow around it, a stark contrast to the storm's relentless fury. The chimney puffed soft curls of smoke into the grey sky, and the faint warmth radiating from the windows reached Max even through the icy wind. He climbed the small porch steps, his paws slipping on the icy wood. Gently, he placed the kitten down, her tiny body trembling against the cold surface. Max let out a weak bark, his voice barely audible over the storm. He barked again, his small frame collapsing beside her, his strength finally giving out. The two small creatures lay there, their breaths shallow but steady, as the storm raged on around them. The golden light from the house bathed them in a soft glow, a beacon of warmth and hope in an otherwise frozen and unforgiving world. James Parker, a 60-year-old retired firefighter, sat in his small house on the edge of town. The snowstorm outside battered the windows, the wind howling like a relentless banshee. James stared into the flickering flames of the fireplace, his thoughts drifting as they so often did. The warm glow of the fire reflected off his weathered face, his grey hair falling over his furrowed brow. This house, tucked away in the snowy outskirts, had been his retreat for nearly a decade, a place to hide from the ghosts of his past. James had once been a man of action, rushing headfirst into burning buildings, saving lives, and bringing comfort to those in peril. But all of that had ended the night he lost his wife and daughter in a house fire he couldn't stop. Despite his best efforts, the flames had consumed everything he loved. The guilt had eaten away at him, forcing him to leave his career and retreat to this quiet, solitary life. He rarely left his home now, finding solace only in the monotonous rhythm of chopping wood, tending the fire, and surviving each passing day. The storm raged on, but James was accustomed to the sound of the wind howling through the trees. He didn't think much of it until he heard a faint noise, something barely audible over the storm. A bark. James froze, tilting his head toward the window. It came again, weak and desperate, his brows furrowed as he stood, pulling on his heavy coat and boots. Whoever or whatever was out there wouldn't survive long in this weather. Grabbing a flashlight, James opened the front door. The wind blasted him immediately, sending a chill through his entire body. Shielding his eyes, he peered into the storm. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, just a few feet from the porch, his flashlight beam caught movement, a small, trembling figure. James stepped forward and gasped. A skinny, golden puppy stood there, barely able to keep his legs steady. In his mouth, he held a tiny, lifeless-looking kitten. Both animals were soaked through, their fur matted with snow and dirt. The puppy looked up at James with pleading brown eyes before his legs gave out, collapsing onto the porch. "Oh, you poor things," James muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Kneeling, he carefully took the kitten from the puppy's jaws. Her tiny body was ice-cold, her fur damp and clinging to her fragile frame. He scooped the puppy into his arm and cradled them both against his chest. Their frailty was heart-wrenching. Bringing them inside, James set them gently near the fire. He moved quickly, grabbing towels and blankets. Wrapping the kitten in a soft towel, he rubbed her tiny body to bring back circulation. She stirred faintly, letting out a weak mewl, her swollen eye barely opening. The puppy, too, let out a small whimper as James dried him off and laid him on a warm blanket. James sat back, watching the pair with a mix of relief and worry. The puppy had curled up protectively beside the kitten, his small frame pressing against hers as though shielding her from the cold even now. Despite their exhaustion, there was a bond between them that James couldn't ignore. He reached out to gently stroke the puppy's damp fur. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" he murmured. And you? His gaze fell to the kitten, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. It was then that he noticed something unusual. Around the kitten's neck was a small, weathered collar. Attached to it was a metal tag, worn and barely legible. James leaned closer, his brows furrowing as he read the faint engraving. Luna, and beneath it an address. 153 Maple Street. Luna, James said softly, testing the name as he glanced down at the kitten. He turned the tag over in his hand, his mind racing. 153 Maple Street. He knew that street. It was in town, not far from here. But why would a kitten with a collar and an address end up abandoned in a snowstorm? His eyes moved back to the puppy, who was now watching him with weary but trusting eyes. "And you, little guy," James said, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Where did you come from? How did you find her?" The storm outside roared on, shaking the windows as if echoing James's questions. For now, all he could do was keep them warm and safe. Yet the sight of the tag gnawed at him, stirring a long, dormant sense of purpose. Something about these two, how they had found their way to his porch in the middle of a blizzard, felt like more than chance. James resolved to find answers. For now, though, he turned his attention back to the fire, watching over the two small creatures as they began their slow journey toward recovery. The morning after the storm, the sun rose weakly over the snow-covered town, its pale light reflecting off the white expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. James stood at his kitchen window, gazing out at the frozen landscape. The blizzard had finally subsided, leaving a calm, eerie silence in its wake. Inside the house, the soft crackle of the fireplace was the only sound, as Max and Luna rested on a pile of blankets near the warmth. The sight of Luna's collar and the faint address engraved on her tag had lingered in James's mind all night. Who would abandon a kitten so fragile, especially in the middle of a storm? And why? He couldn't shake the questions, nor the quiet, nagging urge to find out the truth. After checking on the two animals, James bundled up in his coat and boots. "I won't be long," he murmured, glancing at Max, who lifted his head sleepily before curling back around Luna. The sight brought a faint smile to James's face, but it quickly faded as he stepped out into the cold. 153 Maple Street was a modest house on the edge of town, its weathered exterior now obscured by snow. As James approached, it was clear something was wrong. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds now buried beneath the snow. A bright red notice was nailed to the front door, foreclosed, property of First National Bank. James sighed, the familiar weight of sadness settling in his chest. He had seen this scene many times before during his years as a firefighter, families forced to abandon their homes, their lives upended by circumstances beyond their control. Yet this time, it felt personal. A voice broke his thoughts. "Looking for someone?" James turned to see an older man standing on a nearby porch, bundled in a thick coat. His wrinkled face held a mix of curiosity and weariness, the kind of look that belonged to someone who'd lived in the same neighborhood for decades. "I was," James replied, stepping closer. "Do you know what happened to the people who lived here?" The man nodded, his expression turning somber. They were a young family, husband, wife, and their little boy. Bank foreclosed on the house last week. They had no choice but to leave, and they didn't even have a car to get far. Walked out with what they could carry. James frowned. "Did they have a kitten, a small white one named Luna?" The old man's brow furrowed in thought. "Ah, yes, they did. The boy adored that cat, carried it everywhere like it was his baby. But with the storm coming and no way to keep her, I heard they left the kitten near the woods. Probably thought someone might find her, or maybe she'd survive on her own." His voice softened. "Hard choice, but desperate times make people do things they'd never dream of." James stood in silence, his heart heavy. The thought of a family, likely too broke to even consider a shelter for their pet, abandoning it in the hopes of mercy, struck a chord deep within him. He had spent much of his life rescuing people from the worst moments of their lives. Now it seemed he had unknowingly become part of this family's desperate attempt to save their kitten. "They didn't have another option, did they?" James said quietly. The man shook his head. "None that I know of. Can't blame them for trying, though." As James made his way back to his truck, the words of the old man echoed in his mind. He couldn't bring himself to feel anger toward the family, though the act of leaving a helpless animal in the cold tugged at his heart. He understood desperation, the kind that forced people into impossible decisions. In his years as a firefighter, he had seen families shattered by loss, their lives torn apart by things they couldn't control. Yet this small kitten, abandoned but alive, felt like a fragile thread of hope. Luna had survived the storm against all odds and found her way to his doorstep. And then there was Max. Where had the little dog come from? And why had he taken it upon himself to save the kitten? The questions gnawed at James, but for now they would have to wait. When he returned home, the warm glow of the fireplace greeted him, along with the sight of Max and Luna curled up together. Max lifted his head and wagged his tail feebly as James entered, while Luna remained still, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. James knelt beside them, reaching out to stroke Max's scruffy fur. "Well, little ones," he said softly, "looks like it's just us now." The storm outside had passed, but in James's heart, a new sense of purpose began to take root. James had always preferred the quiet of his life. After the storm, he thought the arrival of Max and Luna would remain just another moment of quiet kindness in a life full of solitary days. But his neighbor Martha, a retired teacher with a knack for staying informed about the neighborhood, had other plans. One morning, Martha arrived at James's door with a casserole dish in her hands. "You can't hide from me forever, James," she teased as he opened the door. Her sharp eyes quickly caught sight of Max and Luna curled up together near the fire. "And who are these little miracles?" James sighed, stepping aside to let her in. Over coffee, he told her the story of how Max had found Luna, their harrowing journey through the storm, and their arrival on his porch. Martha's face softened as he spoke, her eyes misting when he described Max's protective instincts and Luna's fragile state. "James," she said, leaning forward, "people need to hear this story. It's about more than animals. It's about resilience, compassion, and finding hope in the darkest times. Let me share it." James frowned. "Share it? What do you mean?" "On social media," Martha exclaimed. "People love stories like this. It could inspire others." James hesitated, but Martha's enthusiasm was hard to resist. Finally, he nodded. "If it can bring some good, go ahead." Within hours of Martha posting the story online, it began to gain traction. She wrote about Max's heroic act of carrying Luna through the storm, James's compassion in taking them in, and the warmth they all found together. Accompanied by a picture of Max and Luna curled up by the fire, her words struck a chord with people far beyond their small town. The story went viral, spreading across platforms and collecting thousands of shares and comments. Messages poured in, some praising Max's bravery, others thanking James for his kindness. Offers of support came flooding in, from donations to heartfelt notes of gratitude. Amid the flood of messages was one that stopped James in his tracks. It came from a man named Richard Harper. The message was short, but its tone was filled with emotion. "I think that kitten is ours. Her name is Luna. We had to leave her behind during the storm. Can I come to explain?" James stared at the message, feeling the weight behind those words. After a moment, he replied, "Come by tomorrow. I'd like to hear your story." The next day, a man in his 40s arrived at James's doorstep. He wore a worn jacket and boots caked with dried mud, his face lined with exhaustion. James invited him in, and the man's eyes immediately fell on Luna, who was dozing beside Max near the fire. "She's alive," the man whispered, his voice breaking as he knelt by the kitten. "I didn't think—" James gestured for him to sit, watching as the man struggled to find his words. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Richard Harper. Luna was ours. We had to leave her during the storm, and I've regretted it every second since." Richard paused, his hands trembling as he ran them over his face. "We were evicted last week. The bank took everything, our house, our car. My wife and I had no way to transport anything but the basics, so we walked to a shelter in the next town. They wouldn't allow pets and we didn't have any other options. My son, Michael, begged us not to leave her. He cried the whole way. But we thought maybe someone would find her, someone who could take care of her." Richard's voice cracked as tears welled in his eyes. "Michael hasn't spoken to me since, and I couldn't forgive myself." James sat in silence, letting Richard's words hang heavy in the room. He saw the guilt and pain etched into the man's face, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of what he'd done. Finally, James spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't abandon her out of cruelty. You did it because you had no other choice. That doesn't make it easier, but it does mean something." Richard nodded, his eyes still on Luna, who had begun to stir. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving her, for giving her a chance." "She's a fighter," James said softly, glancing at Max, who wagged his tail faintly. "And so is he. They found each other out there. Maybe they were meant to." Richard wiped his eyes and stood, his gaze lingering on Luna. "I don't know if we can take her back right now," he admitted. "We're still trying to figure things out, but I'm glad she's safe. That's all I could have hoped for." James nodded, understanding the man's unspoken request. "She has a home here, for as long as she needs one." As Richard left, James sat by the fire, watching as Max nuzzled Luna gently. The kitten stretched, her tiny body pressing against the warmth of her companion. In that moment, James felt the weight of the world lift, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. The storm had passed, but the bonds it had forged would last a lifetime. The snow outside had started to melt, leaving the world glistening under the weak winter sun. Inside James's home, the air was warm and filled with a rare sense of peace. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. Max lay stretched out on the rug, his tail thumping lazily as Luna playfully batted at it with her tiny paw. Her once frail body was now stronger, her fur clean and glossy. She still limped slightly and blinked slowly with her recovering eye, but her spirit had returned. James sat in his worn armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He watched the two animals, their bond unmistakable as they curled up together. Max rested his head protectively over Luna, who purred softly in her sleep. They were inseparable now, their shared struggle forging a connection deeper than mere survival. For years, James had lived in the quiet solitude of this house, his days blending into one another without meaning. Losing his wife and daughter had left a void that no amount of time or distance could fill. But now, as he looked at Max and Luna, he felt something stir within him, a warmth he hadn't known he was capable of feeling again. "You two saved each other," James said softly, his voice tinged with both admiration and affection. "And maybe you saved me too." James stood and knelt beside them, gently stroking Max's scruffy fur and Luna's soft coat. They stirred slightly, Luna letting out a soft meow as Max wagged his tail. James chuckled, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty. It felt like a home. Later that day, James stepped outside to clear the last remnants of snow from his porch. The air was crisp but calm, a far cry from the storm that had brought Max and Luna into his life. As he worked, a car pulled up to the curb. James turned to see Richard and his young son, Michael, stepping out. Michael held a small, stuffed animal in his hands, a worn, floppy dog that looked well-loved. "Hi, Mr. Parker," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We just wanted to see Luna." James nodded, waving them inside. Michael hesitated at the door until Luna appeared, peeking out from behind Max. The boy's face lit up, and he knelt down, holding out the stuffed dog. "Luna," Michael whispered. The kitten approached him cautiously, sniffing the toy before rubbing her head against his hand. Michael's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at James. "Thank you for taking care of her." James smiled gently. "She's part of the family now, but you're always welcome to visit." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, nodding his thanks before they left. As James watched them go, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Luna might not return to her first family, but she would always be surrounded by love, here with Max and with him. That evening, as the firelight danced across the walls, James settled back into his chair. Max and Luna lay beside the fire, their quiet companionship filling the room with an unspoken harmony. James sipped his coffee, his gaze lingering on the two animals. In their resilience, he saw hope. In their bond, he found comfort. He realized he hadn't just given Max and Luna a second chance at life, they had given him one too. "Family," James murmured to himself, smiling softly. "We've all finally found one." The storm that had brought them together was long gone, but its legacy remained, a story of survival, kindness, and the unbreakable bond between man and animal. In the quiet warmth of his home, James felt whole once more, his heart no longer burdened by loneliness, but filled with love, purpose, and the promise of brighter days ahead. The story of Max and Luna wasn't just about two small lives surviving a storm, it was about the power of kindness, resilience, and the healing found in connection. It was a reminder that even in the harshest winters, warmth can be found in the unlikeliest of places. James was a man who had resigned himself to a life of solitude, carrying the weight of loss and regret. But through Max's bravery and Luna's fragile courage, he found something he didn't realize he was missing: a family, a purpose, and a reason to smile again. To everyone watching, their story offers a simple but profound truth. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives forever. If you've ever been touched by an animal's love, if you've ever found hope in unexpected moments, or if you believe in the quiet miracles of compassion, share this story with someone who needs it. Because sometimes the storms in our lives bring not just challenges, but also the chance to start over. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find your own miracle waiting in the snow.